Well, good morning. Welcome to Compass. Our mission is navigating people to God. My name's Nate. I'm the pastor here at Compass North Fort Worth. We're so glad you're here. So glad you're worshiping with us. If you're a guest, an extra special welcome to you today. I'd love to meet you after the service is over in our Next Steps area, so I hope you'll stop by. And you know, as your pastor, everybody's always coming to me for advice. They want wisdom, and so I thought I would try to give a little bit of wisdom about today's game as we begin today. I was doing a little devotional this week, and I came across this text of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4 that says this. I think this gives us a clue who's going to win today. And when the chief shepherd appears, right, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. It's in God's word right there. Chiefs are going to win. Now, if I get that wrong, I'm going to have to ask God why he gave me that word. But we're glad that you're here, and you know, I'm excited that you've joined us today. Don't forget to stay for Tailgate Sunday afterwards. It's a great time of community. We got food, inflatables. It's going to be a great time. So, you know, 2 weeks ago in the NFC Championship game, Raheem Mostert, he was a household name just because of that game. He became a household name. And the reason is, in that game, he rushed for 220 yards and 4 touchdowns. And what makes his story amazing is that he was not a guy that anybody would have expected to be that guy. He had been cut by 6 NFL teams. He had been undrafted out of college from the University of Purdue. One of the teams that he got cut by was the Cleveland Browns. Like, if you get cut by the Browns, let's be honest, like, you're not very good, right? But somehow, Mostert, he made his way onto the 49ers as a special teams player, and over the last couple of years, he's just been proving himself. And in one of the biggest games of the season, because of some other injuries to other running backs for the 49ers, he got his chance, and he proved himself to be one of those dark horse stories. And you know, we love stories like that, don't we? We love these dark horse stories, how somebody who's just an ordinary person that nobody expects does something extraordinary. And that's what we've been digging into as we kicked off this series last week called Dark Horses. And we said that by definition, a dark horse is a little known person unlikely to succeed who ultimately accomplishes great things. And it's really our hope through this series is that each and every one of us would understand that God can use you, that no matter what you may think about yourself, that God can use you, that we all have these hopes and these dreams that we maybe be used by God. And I'll hopefully help point you to finding that place where God can use you the way he's called you. And we resonate with these stories because I think sometimes we want that to be our story, but it's hard because we don't think that we could ever attain that status. But what I've seen as I've been studying through this series and these characters we're going to look at over the next few weeks is that God always does his greatest work through the most unlikely of people. And today's story proves just that. And the story we're going to look at today is one of those I think, one of the great heroes that we find in all of Scripture. It's a story of this guy named Moses. And Moses is much like you and me. When God called Moses to go do what God was calling him to, Moses made some excuses, and maybe you've made some excuses in what God is calling you to. You know, last week I asked this question at the end of the message. We were talking about this guy Nehemiah. I asked you this question: what is it that breaks your heart that you need to do something about? And maybe as you thought about that question, you thought, man, there's something I know that I should be doing, and you really want to do it. But then as you begin to think about it all week long and you process that question, these excuses came flooding in, like, I can't do it, as I don't have the time, or I don't have the abilities, or I don't have the talent, or I just don't have the resources. But you know, in every dark horse story, the dark horse has to overcome the excuses in their life to do what God calls them to do. And my hope through this message today is to challenge you to stop making excuses and be used by God the way he wants to use you. Because if we keep making excuses, here's what I believe happens. If we keep making excuses, especially for those of us who are followers of Christ, I think we can get to the end of our life and we can look back at our life and we can go, man, I wasted my time here on this earth. And I don't think that's how any of us want our lives to be described. The reality for some of us is I think we get to the end of our lives and we can have this checklist of things that we can look at and we can go, man, how did I do in this area? And we check the box, I did that. And then there's a box that says Christian. Yeah, I can check that one. I followed Jesus with my life. I got baptized. I live for him. And this is the day that I made that decision to follow him with my life. But then below that box, Christian, there's another box. It's a significant box. And the question beside that is, did you live a life of significance for God by doing something for him? And we'll look at that question and we'll want to check the box. But as we think back on our lives, we'll think, man, I wish I could check the box, but I really didn't do anything significant for God with the time that I had here on this earth. And I don't think that's what any of us want. But the only way that doesn't happen in our lives is that we've got to stop making excuses and we've got to start overcoming them, because the reality is this, is that excuses are tools used to build a life of nothingness. Now, I want you to write that down somewhere or take a picture of that and put that's on your bathroom mirror or in your car, and you read that every single day, because I think this is so true. Excuses lead to nothingness. And I don't think any of us, that's how we want our life to be described, as a life of nothingness. And so my hope today is to help you not only see that God can use you, but God will use you if you let him. And it's through Moses' story that I think that we can learn some really practical things for overcoming these excuses. Now, if you've got a Bible or a Bible app, we're going to be in Exodus chapters 3 and 4 today, and we're going to look at just a few key verses there. And so I would encourage you in this next week to go back and read chapters 3 and 4 to get the whole story there. But I think these verses that we're going to look at today can really help us understand, how do we overcome these excuses in life? And I think this guy Moses, whether you grew up in the church or not, you probably have this picture of who Moses is, because maybe you've heard a little bit of his story. Like maybe when you think about Moses, what comes to your mind is Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments, or maybe for some of you, when I think of Moses, I think of Mel Brooks and Monty Python, right? Or some of you, when you think about Moses, you might think about Moses as the Prince of Egypt in the animated movie. That's what comes to your mind. Now, Moses is a guy who leads over 1 million Israelite people out of Egypt and their oppression that they were in and the slavery that they were in. But this doesn't happen overnight. He is not an overnight success story. In fact, Moses, he's reluctant to do what God calls him to, and he makes excuse after excuse for not doing it. And ultimately, what happens though is that God keeps pressing into him until finally Moses gives in. And God speaks something into Moses' life that I want to show you at the end of this message today that I think we all need to hear. And so to kind of set up where we're going today, I'm actually going to look at one verse in chapter 2 that kind of helps understand why God calls Moses. This is what it says, Exodus 2:23. Years passed, the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. And so what we read here is that the Israelite people, they've been in Egyptian slavery and captivity for 40 years, and they're begging God. They're like, God, would you please just free us? Would you send someone to let us go? And this is where God decides to do something extraordinary through this ordinary guy named Moses. And so we've moved to chapter 3, and in verse 10 of chapter 3, this is God's call to Moses. He says this, he says, now go. And it's important, those two words there. Those two words, what God is saying, he's like, it's time to move it, Moses. It's time to take action. Or those words could also literally be translated this, it's time to die to yourself. Now, that's important to remember, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later. But God says, now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people, Israel, out of Egypt. So God calls Moses out. It's time to lead, but guess what the hero of our story does next? He makes an excuse, but not just one excuse. Over the course of these 2 chapters, Moses is going to make 5 different excuses for why he can't be used by God. Now, for those of you who have kids, you know what this is like, right? Like kids are notorious for making excuses. I asked my son Blake to take out the trash last night. He made the excuse. He got his arm injured in a basketball game and he couldn't lift it up high enough. He's like, I can't pull the trash bag out of the trash can, right? And so he made this excuse. That's what we do. This is what Moses is doing in this moment. He's trying everything that he can to get out of what God is calling him to do. God's calling him to lead, and Moses is reluctant. Maybe you can relate in your own life. But here's the thing about God. What I've learned about God is that your reluctance doesn't scare God. And I think this is really important for us to understand because we can make excuses. And we will see Moses make these excuses, but what we also see is that even though Moses made these excuses, God just keeps calling him. And the excuses that Moses makes are much like the excuses that we make. Look at this first excuse that Moses makes in chapter 3, verse 11. This is what it says. He says, "But Moses protested, 'Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?'" The first excuse that Moses gives is this excuse of identity. He's like, "God, who am I? I'm a nobody." Like Moses has been living out in the wilderness, and so he's thinking to himself, like, nobody will even know who my name is. They wouldn't even see me as a leader. God, you can't use me. But listen to God's response. Chapter 3, verse 12 says this, God answered, "I will be with you." I understand what God's saying here. He's like, I hear what you're saying, Moses, but you got to realize you're not doing this on your own. I'll be with you. You're not alone in this. And you see, whatever it is that God is calling you to do, what we need to recognize is that it's less about us than we think. When God asks us to do something, he's really just saying this. He's like, would you just let me use you to do something big? Like, would you let me work through you to accomplish great things? You see, God, he just wants to work through us to do great things. I think sometimes we think that we've got to do it and it's all going to be on our own. But what we have to understand is it's God working through us. And when God works through us, we just have to thank ourselves and be lucky enough that God has chosen us to be used by him, that we get to go along for the ride. God wanted to work through Moses. He wanted to do something through him that even Moses didn't think was possible, which is why he makes these excuses. But Moses isn't done. He goes on. He makes another excuse. Verse 13 says this, "But Moses protested. If I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them?" This is Moses' excuse this time. He deals with insecurity. He's like, what if they ask me questions and I don't know the answer to those questions because God, I don't have the training. I don't have the right words to say. I didn't go to school for this. I'm not qualified. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt that way about what God's calling you to? Like you just don't feel like you have what it takes because you're not qualified? My guess is that there might even be some of you here today who have maybe never shared your story of how you came to Jesus. Or you've decided not to serve and use your gifts, whether that's here at Compass North Fort Worth or outside in the community because you think, I'm just not qualified. But you know what God tells Moses? He says, tell them that God sent you. Tell them that he qualified you. And if I'm Moses in this moment, I'm like, gee, thanks God. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. So he immediately goes to his next response and he gives another excuse. In chapter 4, verse 1, it says this, "But Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, the Lord never appeared to you?" Moses' third excuse, it deals with influence. He's like, what if they don't respect me? He's probably thinking about his own past. Because Moses had made some mistakes in his past, and he's probably thinking back to these things that he'd done and the failures that he had. He's probably even thinking back to this moment. The reason why he's living in the wilderness at this time that God calls him is because Moses had murdered this Egyptian who was harassing one of his fellow Israelites, and he had to go on the run. He had to hide from Pharaoh. And so he's probably thinking back on all these mistakes and even the anger issues that he had, and he's thinking, man, what if somebody digs it up? What if TMZ or the National Enquirer puts out the hit on me and they find out and they try to discredit me? You know, I think this is something that we can all use as an excuse. I just don't have what it takes. We allow insecurity to fill us, and we don't allow God we don't allow ourselves to be used by God because we're just worried about what others will think of us. I think this is so true when we're young, but I think at any age in our life, it's something that we can use as an excuse. I was just having this conversation a few months ago with my kids. I think my kids, God has gifted them to be leaders in their different circles, and I tell them that all the time. I tell them, I think you're a leader with the kids that you hang out with in your friend circle. You're a leader with your teams that you play with. You're a leader even in our student ministry here at North Fort Worth. And I tell them that. But you know what? Some of the things that they said to me when I told them that, they said, but Dad, we're just young. We're too young. There's kids who are older who are way more ready for leadership than we are. We don't have the influence. We're not popular, Dad. Nobody's going to listen to us. And I think that's an excuse that we can use for not doing what God calls us to. And that's what Moses tries to do here. He says, I just can't make a difference because I don't have the influence. But that doesn't work, so he has to go on to the next excuse. In chapter 4, verse 10, it says this, but Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied, and my words get tangled. I think this is where Moses starts getting desperate. Like now he's on his hands and his knees and he's like, God, please, I just am not the right person for this. Could you just use somebody else? And this excuse that he uses is this excuse of inadequacy. And we're going to talk more about this in the character we look at next week. But Moses has his own inadequacy issues. In his mind, God tells him, look, I'm going to be with you, Moses. You just got to trust me, follow me. But Moses is like, well, here's the problem, God. I hear what you're saying, but I'm a terrible communicator. He's like, I got a stuttering problem, God. Like I have a problem standing in front of people. I'm not good with my words. I don't like to talk in front of people. In fact, if you make me stand up in my public speaking class, I get really sick and I almost throw up every single time. And maybe you can relate. Because you've used that excuse of inadequacy in your own life. You know, I remember when I felt called to ministry, I was about 14 or 15 years of age. And so I thought, well, if I'm supposed to go into ministry, then I better figure this thing out. And so I started to find opportunities that I could to just make sure that ministry was for me. And so I remember our student ministry always went to this thing every spring around spring break called Ohio Teens for Christ. And at Ohio Teens for Christ, they had this competition for guys who were going into ministry called the Preacher Boy competition. I know, like real original name, right? And I was like, well, you know what? If I'm going to be a pastor, I'm going to be a preacher, I better figure out how good I am, how I stack up against all the other guys. And so the competition was basically you wrote a 10-minute sermon, and then you had to preach it in front of these judges. And so on the day of the competition, I had put my message together. I walked into a room. It was a big room, just like this room. And there were a whole bunch of people, just like there are a whole bunch of people right now, sitting in the chairs. And there were some judges that were right up here. And they were going to judge all the preacher boys that day. And as I walked to the front of the room and I introduced myself and they told me I would go at this time, I just started to sit down, and all of a sudden I realized I didn't actually like speaking in front of people. Like I hated it. And I thought to myself, what am I doing? How do I get out of this? What am I going to do? And my stomach started to get in knots, and I almost threw up about 4 times. And then I had to go, and they called my name, and I'm like, oh, now I've really done it. And so I got up on the stage, and I think I had 10 minutes, but I spoke that message in about 4 minutes, and nobody could actually understand it. Because after it was over, one of the judges said, thank you. We are all now dumber for having listened to that. I award you 0 points. May God have mercy on your soul. Okay, he really didn't say that, but that's like, I'm Billy Madison, all right? That's for those of you Billy Madison fans out there. But I was so bad that I thought, you know what, I am never going to preach again. In fact, it was so bad that my wife, Amanda, who I was dating at the time, she said, hey, if you want to go into ministry, you should never speak in public again, right? And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. I should never speak in public again. So I decided that I still want to do ministry, so what could I do? I know what I'll do. I'll be a student pastor, because student pastors, all they do is they goof off. They go to church camp, they go to amusement parks, and they play video games with kids all day long. It sounds like a great job to get paid for, right? And so I went to college, and for the first 6 months, I thought I was going to be a student pastor. And then I was taking courses for student ministry, and then like 6 months into it, somebody, I can't remember who it was, but I just remember somebody telling me I needed to go into preaching ministry. And I just started laughing out loud, because I was thinking, you have not heard me at the Preacher Boy competition before. And I thought to myself, and I started making these excuses to him. I would do it, but I'm not good enough at this, and I'm not good enough at that, and I'm not good enough at this. And I made all these excuses. And I think here's the reality. When God is nudging you to do something, there will always be some excuse that you can use to fill in the blank. I'm not good enough because. That's what Moses does. He's like, God, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not good enough. I'm not a great communicator. I don't have what it takes. I have a stuttering problem. But catch God's response in verse 12 here. He says, now go. Remember those words from before? I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you what to say. God says, now go. He's saying, what is he saying there? He's saying, Moses, you need to die to yourself. You need to realize I've told you from the very beginning that I will be with you, that I will be in your words, that I will give you the things to say. You just need to trust me. You know, I think about Moses' story, and I think about my own story, and I think, man, I never guessed that I would be standing here today. That I'd ever be standing on this stage, because public speaking, the reality is this, it's not my gift. Like Friday afternoon, I was running through this one time, and I thought to myself, I'm gonna have somebody else preach this message. Because this is not easy for me to do. But for whatever reason, when I walk on the stage, no longer does my stomach hurt, no longer do I get sick to my stomach, no longer do I feel like I'm gonna throw up. And when I get up here, for some reason, the words are at least coherent because you keep coming back, or at least you're just nice to me. And I'm here today, and I believe it's because of this, and this is what I learned from Moses' story, and what I'm learning in my own story is this. God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. Just like Moses, every person here, I believe God has a story that he wants to tell through your life. I believe that God has a calling for each and every person here today. You've just got to be willing to follow wherever he's calling you to. You see, your excuses, they don't scare God. He's like, just bring them on. You know, I can handle it. I'll take care of it. Your excuses don't scare God. He's just waiting for you to just get beyond them. But Moses wasn't there yet. He's got one more excuse. And this excuse, honestly, God's like fed up with Moses at this point. And God gets irritated with Moses here. But this is the excuse that he makes, verse 13 in chapter 4. But Moses again pleaded. He's like, Lord, please send anyone else. The excuse that he makes this time is an irrational one. God has called him to lead. But he's like, God, could you just send anybody else? I mean, there's got to be somebody else. How about Pete? I mean, he was the valedictorian of our class. He's got excellent communication skills. I mean, he had like a 7.0 on the weighted scale in high school, right? I mean, that dude he's got the it factor. He's the best person for the job. Could you send him? Maybe you've said those same things to God before. You know, last week I asked you that question, what is it that breaks your heart? My guess is that some of you were convicted about something that you should do. There's something that's been tugging at you for some time. And you're like, I know I should do it, but hey, God, I heard what Pastor Nate said last week, but could you send somebody else? Could you use somebody else? Anybody but me, God. Someone else will be generous. Someone else will serve. Someone else will be the one to adopt. Someone else will be the one to change those who are stuck in addiction's lives. Somebody else will do it, not me. But what we need to understand is that God has something specific for each and every one of us. And here's the thing, when God is with you, your excuses are worthless. But God's like, Moses, I just need you to trust me. Would you just trust me? Would you listen to what I'm saying here? And this is what he does. This is really cool. Like, this is my favorite part of this whole story. And I'm like, I don't want you to miss this, okay? So these next few minutes, you just got to really pay attention here. We're actually going to go back in chapter 4 to the beginning of it. Because catch what God does here. After Moses makes these first three excuses, his first one, remember, it had to deal with his identity. The second one, it deals with insecurity that he has. His third one is influence. And then God says this to Moses in Exodus chapter 4, verse 2. Then the Lord asked him, hey, Moses, what's in your hand? God knew what was in Moses' hand. God already knew the answer to his question. This was actually for Moses' benefit. And so Moses, he looks in his hand and he's like, It's a stick. It's a shepherd's staff, God. That's what he says. But I think in his mind, he's probably like, God, you know what this is. This is a stupid stick. It's nothing big, God. There's no big deal to this thing. Why are you asking me about the stick in my hand? Let me ask you, what is it that God might be asking you is in your hand and you've thought, it's nothing big, God. It's nothing big. I'm not talented. I'm too young. I'm too old. I'm too scared. I'm too nervous. I don't have the training, God. Like, I don't have the resources, God. I hear what you're asking me to do. I know that there's something I should do because my heart breaks for it, but it's nothing big that I have, God, that can be used for you. It's just a stupid stick. This is how I think Moses must have felt that day that God asked him these questions. Because here Moses is, he's standing out in the wilderness. He's been doing the same job for 40 years. He's 80 years of age when God comes to him. And he's been wandering around in the wilderness because he's been fearful of his life for the past 40 years because of killing that guy. And as he's wandering around in the wilderness, he's thinking, I have nothing better to do with my life. You look at Moses' story, at this point in his life, can you say dark horse story? I mean, this is really what he is. But what does God ask him? He says, hey, Moses, what's in your wallet? All right, Capital One, Super Bowl, all right? That was just my commercial for the middle of the message. No, he's like, what's in your hand, Moses, right? And Moses is like, it's just a staff. But here's what's cool about this. See, the staff in Moses' hand, it likely represented three things. God knew this. The first thing it represented was this. It represented his identity. The staff represented that Moses, he knew who he was. He knew he was a shepherd at this point in time in his life. This is what he was doing. The second thing the staff represented, it represented his income, which was $0. He had no 401k. The only assets he had were the sheep that he was wandering around with. But that's what it represented. And the third thing that it represented is it represented his influence. At this time in his life, the only influence he had was poking and prodding the sheep or pulling them in the way that he wanted them to go. But that was the influence that he had in his life. And why is this so important? The reason this is so important is this. All of us here today have something in our hands like Moses that God has given to us. For some of us, it's a little. For some of us, it's a lot. And I think the question that God is asking us to think about in our own lives today is this: what is it that's in your hand? For each person, it's different. For some of you, it's talents and abilities. For some of you, it's resources. For some of you, it's wisdom. For some of you, it's influence. We all have something that we are holding in our hands, just like Moses, and we've got to just be willing to say, okay, God, here it is. Let me be used by you. Because you see, it's what we do with what we have that matters. Look at verse 3 and notice what God tells Moses to do next. It says, throw it down to the ground, the Lord told him. And so what does Moses do? He throws it down to the ground. And I broke my stick. Good thing this is the last service, right? Now, why does God say this? Here's what God is trying to help Moses and us understand. We have to be willing to release control of what God has given to us. God's like, let it go, don't hold it back anymore, all right? Some of you got that. Others of you are slow this morning. He's like, let it go so it can be used by me. And so when he drops it to the ground, that stick that was a stupid stick, it turns into a snake. And snakes, I hate snakes. Like why did it turn into a snake? Like, it doesn't make sense to us, right? But in Moses' day, you see, a snake represented two things. It represented healing and power. Here's what I think God was trying to show us through Moses. All right, focus here. In his hand is just a stick, right? But when he gave it to God, it represented two things. It represented healing and it represented power. And the same is true of us. Our identity, our income, our influence, if we keep it to ourselves, it's like this staff was in Moses' hand. But if you let it go and you let God use it, there's power and there's healing. And here's the big takeaway from Moses' story. You will never see God's power at work in your life unless you release what's in your hand. In Moses' case, in case he didn't get this, like God's like, let me just prove this to you, Moses. And so we go on, chapter 4, verse 6, it says this, then the Lord said to Moses, now put your hand inside your cloak. God's saying, Moses, I want you to put your position, your power, your possessions, I want you to hold it close to you like you're not letting go of it, like you're keeping it from me. And then God says, and then after you've done that, then what I want you to do is I want you to take it out and watch what happens. And so the rest of verse 6 says this, so Moses put his hand inside his cloak. And when he took it out again, it was white as snow with a severe skin disease. Moses' hand was now, it had leprosy on it. And God, what he was showing Moses by doing this is that when we keep these things that God has given us to ourselves, it turns into this disease like it did on Moses' hand. And what happens is it begins to make us sick. Just like Moses, maybe that's where some of you are today. That everything that God has given you is in your hand. And you're holding on to it, your time, your talent, your treasure. You've kept it all for you. And the problem with that is this, is when you do that, what happens is you start feeling anxious. You maybe you don't feel content right now. Maybe some of you right now, there's tension in your relationships. There's tension in your life. Maybe there's angst in your life, and it's because you've decided, I'm only focusing on me, and I'm not gonna look to helping others and being the difference maker that God's called me to. But here's the thing. I don't think it has to be this way. In fact, verse 7 proves this. God says, now put your hand back in your cloak, and the Lord said. So Moses put his hand back in, he took it out again, and it was as healthy as the rest of his body. So Moses puts it back in, and when he pulls it out this time, the leprosy is gone. Understand, when you use your gifts for God, that he's given you for his purpose, that's when life gets restored. And God had given these signs to Moses so that he could use them to help prove who he was to the Israelite people and to Pharaoh. But I think God was giving these signs to Moses as well so that Moses would know that God was with him. And I think this is a lesson that we need to remember as well. What's in your hand is exactly what God wants you to use now. But until you release it for his purpose, you will never see it come alive. So let me ask you this today as we close. What's in your hand that you've been using for you? For some of you, it's influence. You're influential in your workplace. Some of you, you're business owners. Some of you, you're leaders at your school. For some of you, you're leaders in your community. For some of you, you're leaders on your teams that you play on. But the problem is, you're holding on to that influence for you. And you're using it just for your own benefit, your own gain, and you're not using it to point other people towards him. For some of you, what's in your hand is your financial resources. God's blessed you abundantly, but you've decided to hold on to what you have for you, and greed is making you sick. For some of you, it's your talents. You've got these amazing gifts and abilities that can be used for God's kingdom, both here at Compass North Fort Worth and outside in the community. But you said, you know what, God, use somebody else. Use anybody else but me. There's got to be somebody else that can use it. What's in your hand? You know what I love about Compass North Fort Worth is that in less than 2 years, this campus has gone from 75 people on the original launch team to over 600 people attending on a weekend. It's amazing. God is incredible, and I love seeing what God is doing here. And God has truly blessed this place, but it wouldn't happen without some amazing and incredible volunteers that we have here that do things each and every week to make this campus exist. I think about our volunteers that get here at 6:45 to set up and make this cafeteria turn into a place of worship, that put up all of our kids' stuff and make it just the best possible experience for people to be navigated to God in the North Fort Worth community. I think about our parking team who gets here early, who puts up signs, make sure that when you drive on the campus, you know where to go, where to park, and for first-time guests, there's a spot for you right by the door. I think about our tech team that runs cables, that hangs lights, that checks the Facebook Live connection, that makes sure that the sound is running so that you can hear what is being said from the stage. I think about our cafe team that brews coffee every single Sunday so you stay awake during my messages, right? And they make those donuts handmade every week in the back. And they bake the cookies for next steps. I think about our greeters who hold the doors, who have a smiling face, who point you to a seat or help get you to a seat when you come in late and you don't know where else to sit. I think about our Compass Kids workers who make sure kids are checked in. They rock babies, they change diapers. Can I get an amen for those people, right? I think about those who console crying children, teach amazing lessons, and lead worship. I think about our NoFo student team leaders who come on Wednesday nights and they lead small groups and they lead worship and they serve snacks and they answer phone calls and texts at all hours of the day because they care about students. I think about our safety and security team who always provide a safe environment for us no matter where we're at. They're always making sure that this is the safest place that it can be on a Sunday morning so we can worship our Lord. I think about our Facebook Live hosts who welcome those who are worshiping online, who make sure that the experience online that you're receiving right now, hello, Facebook Live, is the best possible experience it can be. I think about our Next Steps teams who provides a great experience for our first-time guests and helps people find a way to connect here at Compass North Fort Worth. There are so many of you that I know that are sitting in this room who have stepped up to serve, and I gotta tell you, it's made a huge difference. But if I'm honest, some of these roles that I mentioned, some of these roles get filled by the same people serving in multiple places each and every Sunday. And that's not uncommon in churches across America, but I don't want to be like every other church across America. I want to be different. I want Compass North Fort Worth to be a place where everyone uses their gift because we have all been gifted by God. So here's the deal. When you came in today on your chair, these Next Steps cards, somebody like that, they left that, right? So, when you came in, there were these serve volunteer opportunity cards, and what I've been praying for all week is that there would be so many cards filled out today from those of you who have not found your place to serve, that you would say, you know what, I don't know if this is exactly where I'm served, but I'm interested. This is not signing your life away kind of thing. This is just letting us know that you're interested in finding a place to connect here and to make a difference because we all have gifts. And so what I want you to do before you leave is I want you to fill this card out. Check off the areas where you're interested in serving and just drop those off on your way out at the Next Steps area, or you can just leave them on the chair and our team will pick them up afterwards. But I believe every one of us here can find a place to serve, and we need you to. Because we're just getting started. The best is yet to come. And all indications are, based on everything that we're seeing, that when we get into our new building in about a year and a half or a little bit more than that, we're gonna double or triple in size, and we need you because we're gonna have more people who need navigated to God just like you have been. And I know God wants to do something big through Compass North Fort Worth, but he needs all of us to be a part of it. So let me ask you this as we close again today. What's in your hand that you've been using for you? What is it that you need to say, here I am, Lord, use me. Here I am, Lord, send me. I don't know what it is for you, but each of us has something that can be used for God if we just are willing to let go and let God. Would you pray with me? God, I pray that whatever it is that's in our hand that we're holding on to, the gifts that you've given us, that we would just let go of those things and give them over to you and say, God, how can I be used by you? I'm trusting you just like Moses did. God, help us to stop making excuses. Help us to know that you've told us that if we just trust you, that you'll be with us, just like you were with Moses as he led the Israelites out of Egypt. Help us to release control of what's in our hand. God, I pray that our campus would just be filled with people who love you so much that they would be willing to do whatever it takes to navigate more people to God, and they'd be willing to step up and step out. God, we love you. We pray these things in your name. Amen.